وشكرا على عزيمي. I do not have a PowerPoint today, but I promise I'll make it interesting by moving my hands around like a good Arab. So, so we'll stay on top of things. But I also just want to thank the SWDTP for all your labor and for enacting research activism and knowledge production, even in creating this webinar series. I mean, we're seeing it as a sort of an in vivo way of disrupting corporate ways of learning and the university. I'm really happy to be in community with you today. I am beaming in from the occupied and stolen land of the Pamunkey people. And this is my naming this is important, not only because I was an immigrant child who received settler colonial citizenship to the country, now known as Canada, but also as an ethical and professional commitment as a clinician scholar to the disruption of psychic disavowals that allow us to live under conditions that constantly split off material reality, past and present, of Indigenous life in settler colonial conditions, whether it's Turtle Island or Palestine and Palestine. So this is the starting point of an activist scholarship as sort of ethical imperative for us to reclaim those disavowals. For me, it's also a starting point for a militant commitment to disrupting corporate scholarship, because these disavowals include us being able to live in, metabolize, and stabilize a world where our scholarship, labor, and all else is dislocated from the violence of racial capitalism, imperialism, and settler colonialism, which my fellow speakers, who I'm so happy to be in conversation with, have noted for us. And disavowals work on making us believe that we're somehow not implicated. So the land acknowledgement is beyond just, sort of virtue signaling or a stopping point, but rather a starting point of commitment, not only to land back efforts, but also to our own ethical commitment to constantly disrupt the ways in which we're invited into and conscripted into disavowals. So what I would just want to name is what I said before. This webinar series and our gathering today is an in vivo example of how one disrupts business as usual. Our work is unabashedly, immediately against the corporate and capitalist crush, and is born out of decolonial community building, knowledge production, and non-extractive modes of relationality. And what I mean by that is that it also centers sharing of resources versus colonial hoarding, right? Here we are, we're not like territorializing our work. We're saying there's something to be shared here, and we can do that freely, openly, and engage together. And this is what I would call a political commitment to revolutionary futures and possibilities of being versus remaining in this status quo that constantly, again, invites us into, seduces us into it. I'm speaking to you about my own commitments to disrupt corporate scholarship in all its forms. So when I say scholarship, yes, I'm talking about academia, literally, producing scholarship, but also from my positionality of being both a psychologist and an academic. And these roles are intimately linked up with my also being an abolitionist and an anarchist. So I'm talking today academically, clinically, and professionally, and I have some examples from all those places. And for me, I don't see them as disconnected, and I certainly don't see them as disconnected from my political commitments as an abolitionist and an anarchist. So my guiding questions to what I would call asymmetrical warfare in a neoliberal or corporatist environment, and my partner Finn is speaking in a couple weeks, and he's talking about guerrilla scholarship, and he and I together have been thinking about these things, and that's why I'm using the asymmetrical warfare aspect of it. And I think that ties into what Tamara was saying, is that there's always a power imbalance, so necessarily it's asymmetrical. And so the questions that frame this for me is, what does it mean to disrupt the going on being of normativity without reinscribing it? Right? And going on being is a psychoanalytic principle. And so it's seizing those concepts and saying, what does it mean to disrupt that? Here, for me particularly, I'm thinking about the ever-growing diversity industry efforts, for example, that currently do very little other than stabilize coloniality under the guise of progressivism within universities. And here, of course, I'm thinking about Angela Davis sort of calling this out back in 2015 and saying she has a hard time accepting diversity as a synonym for justice, and it just becomes a corporate strategy. So that's where sort of my framing thoughts come from. The other question is, how do we commit to what I might understand as abolitionist practices of relating to each other, not just to the academy, but to each other, so disrupting all forms of coercion and domination while functioning within systems that themselves are sustained by those practices. So, for example, how do we not allow our desire to object, for example, to be squashed, right? How do we not succumb, especially when we're talking about Palestine, how do we not succumb to the pressures put upon us to not speak to Palestine? To what Tamara was saying is put our necks on the line. We will be attacked, and I'm speaking from personal experience about speaking about Palestine. How do we not succumb to the pressures to not speak Palestine? Because a corporate space demands that we not speak. A corporate space demands that we remain silent, that we remain compliant. How do we attend to the glaring brutality of settler colonialism, to not collaborate, to bend reality in service of settler colonial reality? How do we commit to persistently disrupting these disavowals? That's what I mean about a disavowal. And that is a constant commitment every single day, as any abolitionist might know. It's a recommitment every day to disrupting these logics. Finally, my final question is, along these lines, how do we take seriously a radical redistribution of responsibility for these processes, what Gail Lewis might call walking alongside rather than in front of our students? And I'm talking as somebody who trains clinical psychology graduate students. How do we walk alongside them versus in front of them to move with them to revolutionary possibilities rather than stamping out their fire? Right? Which is what happens in academia, this idea of get your tenure and then do whatever you want. That is also what Fanon warns us about tempering revolutionary fire, and instead making people who themselves are confusion mongers, right? And that's his warning to us. Academics, clinicians, you yourself become the confusion mongers when you confuse. People come in excited and knowing exactly what they want to fight in the world. And in our academic spaces, in our training spaces, we temper that fire and we make compliant subjects. And so that is part of what my framing is. So let me give a couple examples of how I've tried to work through this. And of course, I'm very much excited to hear more from all of you about how you've done this as well, and to be in more conversation in the Q&A. So this is the part for me, disrupting corporate stability, the classroom and consulting space. So I'm often asked to do workshops on diversity or consult with people or places about their diversity efforts. And my immediate response is don't do them. And here's why. The problem of choosing representational diversity over sustained structural change, especially within psychoanalytic spaces, is itself a social production and reproduction, and not an innocent one. I think when we're asked to talk about diversity, we're marking one thing, and that's whiteness, and that's coloniality. And so this is not innocent. It might feel very important for analysts or clinical psychologists to insist that this is innocent, but the problem is that if we're thinking about ourselves within fields and disciplines, my discipline, psychoanalysis, has a history of relying on anti-diversity efforts rather than structural change because the field itself remains inextricably linked to soft power and currency. So the institutional and cultural currency, the necessity of retaining and perpetuating that power, renders any attempt at a viable inclusion movement empty at best and hypocritical at worst. And it's really important for us to have that as a starting point. Like you cannot do this and then just feel like you're going to pat yourself on the back because you're doing diversity efforts, which is what we've been seeing, particularly in the context of the United States after the murder of George Floyd, this sort of manic attempt to say we are attending to these issues without really changing anything. And this is the same logics of exclusion that we see repeated. It's the same texture. There's different words, there's different bodies. Sometimes it's different bodies because there's also a through line of the same bodies being attacked, especially when we talk about Palestine, but different subjectivities, always the same logic, right? And these logics, this diversity efforts are not enough because they peddle a false narrative of inclusivity rather than shifting the actual structural bedrock, which goes against actually psychoanalytic principles. And it fundamentally stabilizes psychoanalysis as is, structures as is, and the entire world as is. this is, again, not innocent. It does this because they're invested in a particular social order that's underscored by ideology. And this ideological position is one that we have to sort of constantly call in as one that can readily imagine, as it can disimagine certain people from diverse spaces. And so it becomes a diverse space, another type of normativity. Even a diverse space becomes normativity, a diverse space without politics. And that's precisely what this sort of empty identity, politic diversity aspects are. It's a defanging of the political aspects of the work that we do. And so here we have, at least to my mind, one part of our answer. Disrupting corporate scholarships means we are explicitly political. I'm explicitly political. So when I'm called upon to consult about diversity efforts, it's yet another avenue for political intervention, and to be honest about that political intervention up front, to destabilize coloniality by putting pressure on the white supremacist ideological tenets of the space itself, the conditions that create lack of diversity, rather than supporting the manic repair for inclusion while the infrastructure is entirely inhospitable to life. Right? So my example here is saying, how do we make diversity and DEI efforts? And I know this is happening across the board, especially in the global north, not just in the United States, as a field of contention itself, right? Rather than what Sarah Ahmed might say is we become institutional plumbers, right? We just do things to like make things flow rather than really disrupting the entire structure itself. Okay, my second example is what I would call disrupting disavowals, and this is professional spaces. And I'm making these separate, not because I believe they're separate, but because they're usually thought about as separate. So one of them is sort of, okay, DI efforts or writing or scholarship. This one is professional spaces, and I'm thinking here about conferences, because a lot of our work or knowledge production is thought to happen in these conference spaces. So I want to give an example. So it's not surprising that the mere mention of Palestine can instigate an ideological psychic break. Okay, so let me give an example of this. This is 2017, so way before any of this stuff was happening with what's happening with me currently, way before that. Approximately halfway through a panel I was giving called, and I'm not making this up, it was just called Talking About Palestine and Psychoanalysis. That's it. A middle-aged white man wearing a white shirt adorned with an Israeli flag made his flagrant entrance into our room. He carried a large paper bag and exuded aggressive energy by locking eyes with me, the only woman, the only Arab on the panel, and repeatedly flexed his biceps and cracked his knuckles as if preparing for a fight. The irony was not lost on me because he appeared to warrior up, wrapping his neck with a kufi. His version was adorned with Israeli flags. So look, just think about this in the space. This man, a psychoanalyst living in New York, blocked the doorway and only entrance to the room for the duration of the panel. He disrupted the panel continually, admonishing the panelists and audience with declarations such as, surprise, there's no such thing as Palestinians, and Palestine has no place in psychoanalysis. As people left the room at the conclusion of the panel, he forced pamphlets onto them that were entitled The 101 Lies That Palestinians Tell. Right? Any of us involved in Palestine organizing know this pamphlet by heart. What's important about this, and why I'm talking about professional spaces and our responsibility to disrupt these issues, is this experience was the first for many people in the audience, because not everybody has a background in organizing or being activist scholars. So attempts to intervene from senior clinicians largely relied on traditional psychoanalytic theory, and they offered readings of what may have been happening in the group process. What was largely missing from these interventions, and what if we disrupt corporate strategies of scholarship and methodology, intervention and analytic helps us, that what was missing was an acknowledgement of what was unfolding in real time. Like there's something happening in front of you, and then rather than attending to that, you're using your theories to abstract it to a hypothetical realm or sort of deflecting it onto somewhere else, right? And what was happening is the ways in which normative ideology are actively weaponized. With my own grounding, what I understood what this man thought was not only his imperative to silence dissenting voices, but also to purposefully deflect and derail a reality testing exercise that was happening that brought Palestine to the forefront against the crushing weight of a dominantly entrenched Zionist ideology. This man was not doing anything in the displacement. It was happening in real time, and part of it matched, right, the sort of logics of disruption that might happen anytime Palestine is spoken. So my own investment in disrupting corporatist scholarship provided a space for me to think, not only think, to keep thinking when this disruption is happening, but also to act in alignment. So I not only pulled out my phone and videotaped him and told him he's making our point for us, but also noted that if we were to call what was happening an enactment, that's what the psychoanalysts want to say, this is an enactment, I was saying that that itself is structurally constitutive of Zionism. If it is an enactment, it's also part of Zionism. That is, this act wasn't arbitrary. It's not an individual or individualized act, but rather a logical extension of the violence of the settler colonial state of Israel, a state that necessitates settler colonial outposts everywhere, right? The settler colonial state cannot be sustained without its outpost. And of course, this was happening in the outpost of the settler colonial colony of the United States, here at a conference to sustain the myth. So no space is safe from these logics. And in the context of psychoanalysis, of course, it was a vigilante attempt to name what constitutes appropriate or pure psychoanalytic content. And this is another space in which settler colonial logics show up. What constitutes true scholarship? What constitutes content that's pure? And it's a practice, of course, that itself is perpetuated by ideology. So here, the enactment exposed a real-time disruption of settler colonial reality bending. So even talking about Palestine, remember that was the title, talking about Palestine in psychoanalysis, even talking about it, speaking Palestine, enacting Palestine, refusing to collaborate and disrupting disavowals is one way in which we refuse corporatized scholarship. And I go back to what Tamar was saying, that some of these things feel small, but in that space, not bending to settler colonial reality is actually an act of presencing, what Indigenous scholars would talk about, remaining present. Okay, my last example is what I would call walking alongside, and this is the clinic part of it because I train clinicians. So I'm often asked by my students what it means to be anti-imperialist, decolonial, and anti-capitalist in practice. And I really do link this up with resisting corporatized scholarship, because when you're training clinicians, you're also training them to work with people and reproduce a particular type of ideology in the clinical space. So not only are they reproducing it in themselves through training, but then they're also passing it along to their patients and passing it along to their supervisees. And so it's really important. What does one actually do to be anti-imperialist, decolonial? Being committed to an anti-corporatist work and clinical pedagogy means, for me, despecializing knowledge and working alongside students as they, according to one of my students, and this is her quote, realize that some fires sear and wound while others sustain life. Right? So let me just repeat that idea. Some fires sear and wound while others sustain life. And again, if we go back to Fanon, what is it like to not tame that fire, the one that sustains life? And so what does this mean in explicitly in harnessing the fire that sustains life? So being a clinician, outwardly saying I'm anti-capitalist, which means making the links between psychic suffering, systemic exploitation, and class warfare known. Right? These aren't secret things to keep from our patients or to gaslight them into thinking their issues are individual, but actually as a result of capitalism and sort of capitalist exploitation. And of course, this is the question I get asked all the time. No, it doesn't mean that we don't make a living wage. It means that we're committed to a practice that's not at the expense of others' sustained livability, right? So your wage cannot be at the expense of other people's livability, and that's what it means to be anti-capitalist. That might mean how you think about fee structure. What do you mean? How do you think about accessibility? How honest you are about that? My private practice, for example, I talk about it as mutual aid and as explicitly meant to redistribute wealth. That's how I talk to my patients about the work that I'm doing. Most importantly, it means that we commit ourselves to speaking to the violence done in the name of capitalist enterprises that are responsible for psychic suffering and for the destruction of the environment in which we all live. And that causes, and the number of times people talk to me about the anxiety of sort of the breakdown of the environment, that is a direct result of imperialism and of capitalism. And so we need to be able to attend to these things. It also means we commit to interrogating the ways in which our field and our practice sustains class inequities and lack of access by design. Again, to move away from innocence. These things are actually encapsulated by design. To be anti-imperialist in these spaces means decentering US-centric, normative, and supportive, and support expansiveness and believe in borders as natural, right? Our egos can't be imperialist or imperious either. We're not entitled to people's interiority just because we are psychologists. And so it's really about normalizing that sort of conversation, and to note that borders imply the violence they need to protect them. Right? By having borders. So to think about also relationality in the context of the psychological space, what does that mean when we talk about the frame? What does that mean when we talk about boundaries? All these sorts of things need to be really at the forefront. It also means that if we practice in the United States, we understand the sociopolitical position of the United States as an imperial power in the world, including the violence it's inflicted on others, especially in the global South. This is not disconnected from our clinical work. This has to be central, because if we're dedicated to an ethical work that is truly committed to the alleviation of suffering, we have to name these as non-negotiable truths. The United States is an imperial power that is intent on destruction of the world through its military prowess and also through colonialism and imperialism, of course. Last two things is we work towards global networks, right? This is, Tamara was saying this, Paul was saying this, this is enacting that. And these global networks work towards equitable representation of folks from the global South, right? Not just in terms of representation, but also in uplifting the work that's being done forever. The work that's being done in the global South is written out and disappeared from our canon, from our training sources. And so our commitment to uplifting that work and centering it is a way to be committed against corporate strategies, because that is not viable for a corporatized scholarship to say that the knowledge production doesn't happen in the heart of empire, right? Finally, we're decolonial, which means to me, and I'm going to read a Sarah Ahmad quote, which to me says it so beautifully. Decolonial means the fundamentally life-affirming task to build institutions or spaces that are not dependent on the diminishment of the life capacities of others. Okay, and I'll post this in there. So I'm going to end there so we have some time for questions. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks.